was raised as an entire company for this wonderful invitation. So thank you for being here. It's truly an honor to be in front of such distinguished guests. So as Massimiliano so kindly introduced the topic, this is a very, very complex topic. The reason why I decided to call this presentation the Global Chess Game is because it truly has to be seen as a very complicated and multidimensional match in which there are different players, and each player has a different motivation and expects a different outcome from this story. So I'm going to just very quickly, we can probably skip actually about the speaker part, but I'll just add to what Massimiliano said. I've been working in different geographies in the world. So New York and London were sort of the beginning of my career, but then I have co-founded a private equity fund in which we made investments globally. I'm also a tech entrepreneur, consultant and investor across different geographies. I'm actually a member of the National Council of the Italian Republican Party, so I'm in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and this is also a political angle that I would like to add to this conversation. And lastly, I'm a board member of the Agency for Economic Development of the Republic of San Marino, where I currently reside. So it's a bit of a mix of policy, economics, and business. So let's start by, probably the first and most important thesis of this presentation. The war in Ukraine is a hybrid war. It's a hybrid war fought on multiple dimensions. There is no time today to go into every single detail, so I've decided to look into three main dimensions of this war. The first is the military and the geopolitical aspect. So obviously, the most immediate aspect of this is a physical confrontation in the Ukraine, particularly in the territory of Donbass. An important point is that this time, for the first time in modern warfare, we see an active use of contracts, so of private mercenaries. Okay, so we've seen, in many different occasions, companies such as Blackwater having a role in conflicts, but generally speaking, this has not been active combat. This has always been a role of support to the main army. In this case, the mercenaries in Russia are truly fighting the war. So this is an important aspect. We'll come back to that. It actually has an important repercussion on a global level. The corollary to this is that there is actually a spillover effect. The spillover effect is going into many different verticals. We have seen Iran and Saudi Arabia changing their dynamics completely. Azerbaijan and Armenia, there is an opportunistic aspect to this. Azerbaijan seized the opportunity and went into Armenia knowing that the US was not concentrated on the region at the time. It had other things to think about. The Balkans, we're seeing it now, there's a flare-up of difficulties in there. And then a big question mark as to Taiwan, what is going to happen to Taiwan. The second vertical is about energy and commodities. And actually, this is probably the most important point from an economic standpoint. So as you can see, pipelines are going from Russia to Asia, no longer to Europe. Turkey is now becoming the European Union's energy hub, no longer Germany. These are tectonic shifts in the world, the way that the world works. US gas exports to Europe are truly on the rise. This is an incredibly important development to this. And similar dynamics can actually be applied to different commodities. Okay, this is the case everywhere. The third vertical, about politics and economics. So we know there was a wedge between West and East. This is apparent. But my point here is that there is a widening wedge between the global West and the global South. And this is a very, very important point. We're going to come back to this later. And another important aspect is that the US is sort of lacking attention right now to many, let's say, minor, more minor aspects of global geopolitics. And therefore, there are players that are now taking advantage of this. So we can skip to the next slide. So, what are the players of this global chess game? So, obviously, at the center of it all, it's Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting its existential war. At the end of this conflict, we will either have a Ukraine or we will have something else, and we don't know exactly what this is going to be. On the left-hand side of this chessboard, we see the military players of this war. So we have the US, the UK, the European Union, and NATO. These are the players that are all in this war, and they are fighting it economically, they're fighting it politically, they're fighting it militarily, first and foremost. Russia, it is actually also looking at this war as an existential war, and we will walk into why this is the case. However, there's another set of players that are really important. And on the right-hand side of this equation, you see China and BRICS, and Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Turkey, all of which are trying to take advantage of the current geopolitical situation to strengthen their position vis-a-vis the global players that they've been working with in the previous decades. Next slide. So, okay, this is going to be the single most important slide of this presentation, so let's walk through it together, okay? So first and foremost, the United States is the preeminent superpower. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, no other superpower has been able to reach anywhere near the level of power of the United States, and this power is actually derived from a number of different pillars. I didn't put them all in the slide, there's different aspects, but these are key and central to the discussion. So first of all, the control of the oceans. Historically speaking, the United States is the only country in the world that is able to control all of the oceans at the same time. Not only it dominates the oceans, but it's able to project military influence in every single corner of the world sustainably. There are other blue water navies. The French have a blue water navy, even the Italians have a blue water navy, but the Italians would never be able to fight a protracted conflict on the other side of the ocean. We could have an intervention, we could go in and out, but we would never be able to have a protracted war. The US is the only country that can do it. China cannot, and will not for a very long time. Russia cannot, and no other players in the world cannot. Now, why is this important? This is important because it is the underpinning of the global system that is basically the protection of trade routes is what makes the US Navy the most important player in the world right now. And it has been so pretty much throughout the century. Secondly, obviously connected to the first point, is the economy. So the US economy is still the largest in the world. It is the most fluid, it is the most interconnected. So true that China is reaching, on a nominal basis, the GDP of the US, but it is a completely different economy. The US is still the global consumer. It will continue to be the global consumer for a very long time. And the dollar is the world's reserve currency. And this is the most important point of this conversation, okay? Why is it the reserve currency? Well, obviously, protecting trade routes, you use the petrodollar, there's the concept of the petrodollar, you need US dollars to purchase energy. This is being challenged. But if you're trading in dollars, you need to invest in dollars. And therefore, the fact that the United States has the largest financial market in the world is what makes the US dollar status as a global reserve currency pretty much a fact for the foreseeable future. I will come back to this point because this is tricky. The third point, and I don't think it is any less important than the previous two, is culture. So American culture is pervasive in the world. Okay, it is the popularity of American culture and the media shapes the global perspective on things. Hollywood is probably more important than the US military budget. I truly believe so. Also, the US universities are unrivaled. There are, of course, many great universities around the world, but nowhere in the world you find such a concentration of well-funded, strong, and advanced universities as in the US. And then we get back to this as well. Then the last 2 points, military and technology, they're actually truly interconnected, right? So the military, well, the US is the most funded and capable military in the world. Actually, the budget of the US military is the same, is actually higher than the combined of all the rest of the world. Okay, so if you sum up everybody else's military budget, you're still coming short of the US. And as I said before, it is able to project sustainable power anywhere in the world. Now, technology is actually very important because this is a very technological war. Okay, this is an incredibly technological war. It is being fought on so many different angles. I won't even touch on everything. I will not talk about, for example, cyber warfare, which is also extremely important, but we don't have the whole morning. So the global edge of the United States in terms of technology is actually derived by several factors that are long-lasting factors. One is the innovation ecosystem that is unique in the world. You have a mentality, so the culture, the entrepreneurial culture, the mentality of trying until you make it. If you start up in Italy and you fail, you will be remembered because you failed. If you start up in the US and you failed, you will be remembered because you tried again. So it's a very intangible thing, but it actually is a very important aspect of this conversation. And the brain drain resulting from all of this, right? So you have research institutions that are dragging the smartest in the world, and this is going to continue to be the case, no matter what happens in the near term. So why did I say that slide was important? It was that slide kind of defines the fact that globalization is the visible expression of US hegemony. So a global world is a world in which the US can best defend its interests. This is an important thesis. When you think about what has been happening in the past few years, not many years, but let's say 10 years, from 10 years ago until now, we're starting to see a challenge to this globalization. And it's not necessarily an exogenous challenge, by the way. To some extent, some US political thinkers would like to see a reindustrialization of the US, would like to cut short on some of the trade routes. COVID actually was also a factor. When many factories were not able to continue their production because everything was stuck in some logistical route, actually this made a lot of companies reconsider the value of offshoring their production. If you then flip side, the fact that we have decided as the global West to invest in production in Asia is now turning Asia to a potential contestant to the global hegemony of the world, of the United States. So as you can see, there is a serious challenge to the concept of globalization. So to some extent, we will see a difference in the way that this is being played. Now, what is the biggest challenger? The biggest challenger is today China. I actually personally believe that in 20 years we will think that India will actually be a relatively more important player. That's for several reasons, some of which actually have to do with research, with the strength of their educational system and how they're being very good at, there's 50,000 startups founded in India in the past 2 years. So India is definitely becoming a player, but in this particular context right now, China is really what we should be focusing on, also because China is truly an important focus of the US foreign policy at the moment. So the Belt and Road Initiative is actually the strategy that China has set in place in order to counteract the US global hegemony, to compete with it. But we need to understand that China's Belt and Road Initiative is not just an infrastructure and economic initiative. Again, it's a hybrid initiative. There's many different angles to this. It is done in combination with other players. One of them is Russia, and we'll come back to that because it's one links back to this war. And there's a political angle to it as well. So, for example, when the Chinese go to speak with the Central African Republic, or they go to speak with any country in the global south that has a need for infrastructure, they come in with an economic discussion, solely based on economic terms. There is no discussion based on sharing of values or making it, like for example, the Europeans would do. If a European country wants to trade, wants to build infrastructure in an African country, there will be a discussion that is encompassing many different angles. The Chinese will be razor focused. So they are going to this alongside with the Russians that have a second proposition. While they build infrastructure, we protect it with our mercenaries. So this is a turnkey solution that is being very effective in gaining a lot of different projects globally. And this is a way for China and Russia to project power. Let's move to the next slide. So now I want to sort of switch the tables a little bit, right? Let's look at things from the Russian perspective. And this is a controversial slide for me. So from a Russian perspective, NATO expansion is seen as an existential threat. So this is arguable, right? In the sense that if you look at the world from the prism of 1940, then yes, of course, you want to have territorial depth, you want to have a certain security buffer, but obviously it would be very difficult for somebody to argue that Finland, as you can see highlighted here, that is the latest member to join NATO, doesn't have enough sovereignty to be able to decide for itself in which military alliance to join. Okay, so it is a narrative that kind of leaks a little bit. So it is difficult for anyone in the West to kind of agree directly with this concept coming from the Russian narrative. The flip side of the story, though, is that we've seen this before. We've seen the Bay of Pigs situation during the Kennedy times, right? And when you start to bring missiles too close to the other side, then things start to get difficult. And this is probably what has, what has been happening for quite some time. You can see from 1999 onwards, actually NATO has been very quick at expanding eastward, and this has certainly made people in Moscow feel unsafe, because when you know that there are 2 minutes away, from you there are nuclear missiles, obviously this makes things different. There is a counter argument to that though. There is Kaliningrad, stuck right in the middle of Europe. So actually Europeans are quite close to Russian missiles too. So this is, again, super complicated. There is nothing easy, unfortunately, in this war, okay? But I wanted to show this slide because I think this can be seen as kind of the most important reason for why is it that Russia is in this war today. And not just, by the way, this war, there's previous wars that have happened that have to do with this as well. Sure.
So do you think this is a real threat or a fabricated threat?
I think this is a really excellent question. So I will try to answer it as directly as possible. I don't believe that this is a real threat. I believe that when you're looking at the way that Russia works, it is an autocratic government that is actually now shifting towards totalitarianism. So for many, many years, at least since the post-Yeltsin era, so since Putin has been in power, it has been extremely important for Putin to always maintain an external threat, an external enemy, where you were able to say, you know what, the reason why your life is not as good as you would like it to be is because we have a really bad enemy somewhere away. So the problem is that sometimes prophecies become self-fulfilling, right? So if you continue to foment that area, then it becomes extremely difficult for you to keep power and not maintain, let's say, that type of narrative, right? So this actually, I would really go back to even the Georgian War, right? So it's going back to probably 2005, 2006. There was no real perceived, threat actually. If you think about it from a geopolitical standpoint, Georgia literally wouldn't, there was no real geopolitical problem behind that conflict. But there were so many internal interests that made it so that this conflict had to happen. And when that started, then this gave additional fuel to the narrative that NATO is a threat, right? So we are looking at a situation in which, of course, there is always the possibility of confrontation. And today, now that Russians invaded Ukraine, the direct confrontation with NATO is becoming a real potential issue. But prior to this, I would have not considered the NATO expansion eastward as something that the NATO itself considered as aggressive. But from the Russian standpoint, seeing this happening in such a fast pace actually was considered politically dangerous. So every time a new NATO member, a new country basically joined NATO, well, this was a politically sore point for Putin to bring home, right? So it's not so much a threat to Russia, it is a threat to the system that is currently ruling Russia. Mm-hmm. And this is really the biggest issue here. But thank you, this is really an excellent question. So I hope.
Follow-up question.
Sure.
Do you agree that it has backfired? Because the threat that was there seems to me, and obviously many other observers, to be now much greater than it was before the war.
So it has backfired for sure for the people. It has backfired for the nation, let's say, as the nation of Russia, which is right now literally finding itself between two fires. It has friendly fire on the east, and we'll talk about it, and it has a proper war going on in its west. But it has not backfired for the power. Putin's ratings have gone up. He's been able to solidify power in a way that he would have never been able to do before. His throne is safe, and he will not be thrown away. This is important, and I think this is the reason why, unfortunately, right now we see Russia going from autocracy to totalitarianism. Because at this point you're looking at people truly becoming victims of the system, and it's extremely sad. And of course, the same is said also for Ukrainians, right? The Ukrainian people right now are under extreme duress, and nobody in the world should ever experience what there is.
So it's backfired, but it's backfired to the U.S.
Well, also, yeah, there's a backfire to a lot of different people. There's a backfire to everybody. There's no winner in this war. This is important. There are only a few players that are taking advantage of this. So some of the players that in the previous slide were on the right-hand side, the Emirates are expanding their influence. Saudis are expanding their influence. But except for those few exceptions, everyone else is losing here. This is important, you know. So again, who is everyone else? Again, we need to always split the elite, the military elite, the political elite, the regular Joe, right? The regular Joe is losing everywhere. That's the key point.
Richard, I would like to add, I think you need to get into a Russian perspective, and the Russian perspective is one and only one. The one in power is consolidating power. That's the only factor that matters. People dying, it doesn't matter. The only strategic objective of this is maintaining power. So it's been successful. The war is being successful from the point of view of the ruling dictator.
Yeah.
That's what you need to look at, really. It's the only point. And when you, of course, all the oligarchs are against this war. Of course, all the high middle class is against this war. But the security system around Putin doesn't allow, contrary to the narrative of the West, which is unreal, that there will be, a rise of Russia. But that's completely an illusion. It's not going to happen. So where the narrative doesn't really match the reality today, and the reality is that, pure and simple, the guy in power is consolidating the power and is controlling the system more and more, and this creates bad consequences for everyone, which is why continuing this war is stupid from my point of view, because it's going to be a lose-lose situation for everyone. The more we stay in, the more it's going to happen like this. And you're not going to conquer Russia with a conventional warfare. And if you could, they will throw atomic bombs, because Putin will. So the only solution is try to stop the war, but we're not doing it. Okay, I'll leave you the word. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Really very interesting questions. So, at any point, please keep them coming, because it definitely makes the conversation more challenging, more interesting. So I will kind of move towards the conclusion of my presentation. So if we can move to well, not the conclusion, actually, this is the center of the presentation. To the next slide, the dimensions of the hybrid war, part one. Yeah. So let's look at the military and the political aspects. This is a war of attrition. Okay, we need to understand a few things about this war and make it very different from what we've seen before. So, importantly, the fog of war in this particular conflict is the thickest that we have seen in any conflict in the past 50 years. There is an incredible amount of propaganda. Let's think just of one fact. The head of Wagner, which is this contractor, this private army of Russia, is actually also the head of the Facebook propaganda of Russia. Okay, so he runs the troll factories. So, interestingly, they are the same person. Okay, so the fog of war here is extremely important. So it is important to understand that when you look at the media's analysis is going to be extremely simplistic. They're going to put it into a very simple, tactical discussion of today's achievements of a potential counteroffensive or whatever not. Well, there are more aspects to this. So the NATO is fighting a more high-tech war, but it is a more expensive warfare than what Russia is fighting. So we are used to think of modern warfare as something that is being fought in pretty much a kind of a simple equation, right? It's a war fought from the air, there is the use of intelligent bombs, there are strategic assets that are removed, you diminish the counterparty's ability to respond to your attacks, and then eventually, once all of these objectives have been achieved, you move in with the troops. Russia didn't do that. Because Russia would have not been able to do that, because if they tried to use their fighter jets to go and bomb something, they would have been taken down. So what Russia did is, they actually went at it asymmetrically. They said, we're going to fight World War II style. We're going to use stockpiles that we have that have been produced in Soviet times for decades and decades, and we're going to make it about 155 millimeters caliber. And you know what? That was actually a very, very smart move from their standpoint, because it takes Europe 2 months to produce the shells that they should shoot in one day. Russians shoot between 25,000 and 50,000 shells per day. Ukraine shoots about 5,000 to 7,000 shells per day. Europe, the entire Europe, builds 25,000 shells per month. So this is a war being fought on, at least at this stage, right? I mean, it is being literally fought as it was in World War II, right? So,
Sorry to
Sure.
interject. I don't know, obviously you have much more information, but was that a strategy, or because Russia didn't have other option, they had to fight with the Soviet arms that they had? And in the very same time, I mean, you see the NATO kind of testing, the war became kind of, a trial for new arms, and also analysis of the limited capability of the Russian army at this stage and their obsolete arms. I don't know if the analysis is correct or not, because I mean, you don't know, as you said, the president to do a very simple analysis.
Yeah.
To date, I only seen one guy talking about all the logistics, all the problems inside Russia and what's going on. But is there a strategy, or they didn't have an alternative to do this?
very, very good question. So I want to make, I want to say a thesis, okay? I don't think Putin is a strategist. I think Putin is a tactic. He's a tactic person. He doesn't do strategy. He's very much of a reactive, at least in the years, until today, we've seen very much this kind of behavior. Now, I would like to say that what you said is true and false at the same time. So Russia has inherited the Soviet Union military, right? It has inherited old Soviet T-52, T-72 tanks, that are being used currently. Soviet tanks that were built in 1952 are currently being used in the war. But let's look at this from the two sides of the medal. The Western press will say, look, Russia is buying munitions from North Korea. They are at the end of this. The Russians say, we're buying munitions from North Korea because it is cheaper to buy it from them than to produce them in our own factories, and we're fighting a war to make it expensive for them. So, do they have modern weapons? They do. Russians have modern weapons. They have modern planes, they have modern missiles, they have hypersonic missiles, but they're still taking very large unguided bombs built in the Soviet times, the Fab 500 and Fab 1500. These are 1.5 ton bombs that they are equipping with some small cheap wings with a liter electric motor that is making this bomb fly in a more guided way, okay? They are taking drones in which the tank for fuel is actually literally a water bottle, the Aquafina water bottle, okay? Do they have the way to build a more expensive and more powerful type of drone? They do. Absolutely, they have. They have a very important military industry. But that's not their war. Their war is to make it as expensive as it gets for NATO to fight this war. So they're going to use the cheapest possible way to answer to whatever it is that we bring over to the table. So this is really...
That's very interesting. I haven't thought of that. It's very interesting analysis.
Think of the T-50, the T-72 tanks, okay? They have a very modern tank that they built, okay? There's been, according to different sources, you can read a lot of different things. Some sources say that they had issues with production. Other sources say that they're producing 100 per month. I won't know. There's no way to know, to be honest, right? The fog of war here is really, really thick. But let's say that half of it is true, okay? Let's say that they're building 50 of those tanks per month. Germany gave 100 Leopards, and it took, the strongest political resolve to be able to get 100 tanks to Ukraine. Russia is building 50 modern ones every month, but it's sending the old ones to battle, not as tanks. They're using it as movable artillery. They don't use them as you would use a regular tank. If you want to use a regular tank, you need to have a supporting system around it. You need infantry, you need mobilized artillery. There's a lot of different things that go to support the tank. But if you're taking a T-72 that fires the same ammunition round that you have 20 billion of, stockpiled since 1948, yeah, you just make it so that the cannon can go a little bit higher, and that's a howitzer now. It just moves faster. So, but we're not seeing that, right? When our journalists look at this, they say, oh my God, they're using pieces of museums to fight this war. We don't understand this angle, and this is extremely important because ultimately, actually, I'm going to make it even, another example. We often say, well, Russia's economy is the size of Spain. So what could Spain do? I mean, what is it that Spain could do on the global world level? Pretty much nothing. I mean, honestly, they could go and fight a small conflict like any other blue water Navy country, right? But they cannot have a sustained global war with 30 different countries. They cannot do that. Why can Russia do that? Because their $100 billion of military expense is not the same as $100 billion of military expense in the US. Because Russians have verticalized everything. They have the iron ore mine, they've got miners that probably pay very, very low. They have the entire value chain going all the way down to the production of ordnance and planes. So those 100 billion can go a lot further than they could in any country in the West, which means that they can actually try to have a level playing field, also thanks to the fact that their logistics is next door. They just ship to 1 kilometer away, right? We need to have to build logistical chains that are extremely long, and as you know, 1 liter of gas, of gasoline being brought from 1 kilometer doubles in price almost, right? So it's actually quite an interesting situation. So it's about economics. There is a reason for that, right? I want to just kind of finish on this particular point because it's connected to what you said, right? So Russia is fighting a World War II style war, and it's benefiting from the war machine vertical integration. So they go from iron ore to ordnance. The Soviet stockpiles that are infinite. We don't even know how many there are. It seems like Soviet Union only continuously produced weapons. They just produced so many of them. They sold them everywhere in the world. And Ukraine is using those same weapons. Have you ever seen that the Russians at the beginning of the war started painting the letter Z on the tanks? Mm-hmm. The main reason for that, it became a meme effectively, right? But the main reason for that is because the tanks are the same. So they wouldn't be able to tell that's a Ukrainian tank or a Russian tank. So they had to do something. They invented the chalk. They used the chalk, and you see, it's cheap, but it's effective. That's the mantra here, right? The favorable commodity price environment is incredibly important, right? So we think we're going to exhaust them, maybe, but it's not as difficult as it would be if oil was at $30, okay? If oil was at $30, then yeah, I think the Russians will stop fighting in a few months. But oil being high, gas prices being high, is actually a way to maintain the ability to pay for this fighting. And the last point is Wagner. Again, I'm going to keep on coming back to Wagner because it truly is something incredible. Wagner is using conscripts to fight this war. So they go to jail, they tell people, look, you have 20 years left, or you can go to fight. If you come back alive, you're free, right? So what does it mean? On a political level, it is easier to fight a war when the people dying are convicts. Because, one thing is a 21-year-old boy coming home, and that makes it difficult politically. Another thing is somebody that committed homicide, and then, he died in the war, well, too bad. So you're achieving what objectives? You're making it easier to last longer because you can have more deaths. This is brutal, by the way. I understand what I'm saying is absolutely brutal and it's gruesome, and nobody, in no other circumstance, probably no other country would do that. But this is being done right now. The Putin regime is doing it. The second point is, I'll just finish the ideas. So it makes it cheaper to run the prisons. They don't have to pay for them, so they go to war, right? And thirdly, it trains an export good, because they want to export security. So now they go to war, they fought there, they are now engaged in Wagner. Some analysts say that by the end of this conflict, they will have 200 to 300,000 trained ex-conscript that can fight in global, that can provide security globally, right, to different clients globally. So these are all aspects that, all together make it for an incredibly multidimensional war. Sorry.
That's what I was going to ask, how deep the Wagner bench is. There were reports this weekend that Russia lost 20,000 troops, over the last month or something.
Yeah, and pretty much half of them were Wagner, actually. So the Wagner guys are the ones that are sent. So Bakhmut, right? The Bakhmut has been sort of in the news for quite a long time. This has been a place where, for many, many different reasons, basically both armies decided to concentrate a lot of attention. Well, Russia actually literally sacrificed Wagner to Bakhmut. They just continued to send soldiers over there. And, by some estimates, the Wagner losses just in Bakhmut are 30,000. but there are probably another 80,000 people training for or joining Wagner at the moment. And by the way, conscripts, maybe people that are today in jail, but also these are people that could have been in jail 10 years ago, they still couldn't find a job, and now suddenly they have a way to fight for themselves by going to Wagner, right? It is becoming a phenomenon, actually. And again, let's remember that Prigozhin, head of Wagner, is also the guy who runs propaganda on social media. So this is being used, it's a machine. It's a machine. So what is my main thesis on this? I believe that Russia hopes to hold out long enough for NATO and the US to exhaust their resolve and shift their attention to China. That's their goal. Putin made a mistake, he should have never invaded. This was way above his
Pay grade.
his pay grade. Okay, he should have never done that. Obviously, this is a gruesome fact, but he did it. And so now, tactically, the only thing he can hope for is to, basically outlast our patience. This is not only patience, by the way, also political resolve. Because in many countries, people are starting to feel the pinch because of this war. And so the key factors on this are two, but really the most important one is the elections in November 2024. Depending on what happens there will be different outcomes of this war. I'm going to be a bit more specific in the next slide, in the next slides about this.
Can I, Samir, one
Sure.
question before we get
Absolutely.
there? I hate the idea that we're rushing you through this, so there's a lot of...
Yeah, I'm actually kind of losing a bit of sense
No,
of
it's
time.
fantastic. The presentation's amazing. Is the West's false premise that they can win the war of attrition, does that make Europe a sacrificial lamb?
Very good question. Okay, so I don't believe the West can win this war of attrition. I'll be very honest. I
I'm
don't
with
believe
you,
it's possible.
But I'm with you. But is the sacrifice of this Western thought before China enters, we lose Europe?
Yeah, we will see in the next slides. Probably, pretty much.
Okay, keep
pretty
my mouth
much.
shut.
Pretty
Go ahead.
much. No, you're right. Pretty much, this is what's happening.
Go ahead,
Okay?
go ahead.
I don't think this is an intended consequence.
Yes.
But I think this is an effect, and unfortunately, it's happening. Okay, as I said at the beginning, right? The pipelines used to be going from Germany to Russia. Now they go from Russia to Asia. Well, this is impacting Germany. It's now in a recession for the first time, and it is a recession based on consumption. It's of lack of consumption of German goods. This is truly changing the way that Europe exists, and I believe that this will be another angle of the confrontation, because if Europe is fragmented, Russia and China can have sway over Europe in a different way. It's much easier to convince Italians to vote for a particular party by helping them, through social media activity of, dubious origin, and again, the same guy is fighting with Wagner, right? It's much easier to influence European politics when Europeans suffer. And I think the unintended consequence of this is this, okay? So we move to maybe I'll literally get to that point. Really.
Okay.
So let's move to the second slide, so the dimension of hybrid war part 2. Yeah, this is it. Thank you. So very quickly, because I think we're probably running out of time, but so on the left-hand side, I just picked two charts that are literally touching upon this. Norilsk Nickel's revenues. Norilsk Nickel is one of the largest nickel companies in the world. I think it's the third by reserves. And it's actually part of it used to be part of Mikhail Prokhorov's empire when I was working there, so I know that company very well. So in 2021, more than half of their exports were to Europe. In 2023, on the first quarter, and by the way, it has gotten worse now, only 24% of their exports are to Europe. Who's picking up the tab? It's Asia. It went from 27% to 45% of nickel consumption or imports from Norilsk Nickel. The second slide shows you the set of new pipelines that are being built in Asia. The power of Siberia is being enhanced, and the power of Siberia 2 is going to shift the Yamal field, which is one of the largest in the world, gas production that was fully dedicated to Europe, pretty much will be shifted towards Asia. So, yes, Europe is being left behind here. And the Europeans are in a very difficult conundrum, okay? They need to really understand what's going on, and they don't. They don't because the media, again, is unable to cut through the fog of war. It's unable to analyze the situation. And also, by the way, it's unable to understand that this is a geopolitical shift of such size that we haven't seen it since 1945. This is really a thesis that I believe in. So, who is benefiting from this? China. China is truly benefiting from this right now, in the short term. Okay, it benefits because commodities are shifting towards itself, and it is becoming more technologically speaking. By the way, China has done strides, right? It's now incredibly. It's never going to be as close to the West when it comes to chip technology, and that's why Taiwan becomes an interesting conversation, but we're not getting into that, we don't have time today. But China is benefiting because simply the economic conditions are better. It is able to buy more commodities at a cheaper price. It is pretty much the market maker of Asian commodities right now vis-a-vis Russia. And so my thesis, which is a weird thesis, is that either a Russian victory or a Russian loss is detrimental to China. China doesn't want Russia to win. China doesn't want Russia to lose. China wants Russia to fight. So long as they continue to fight, these conditions will persist. Russia can consolidate its economic strength and continue to produce, more more goods that Europe is buying, right? And Europe is buying them because it's now way more cheaper to buy Chinese goods than it is to buy European goods. Our producer price index, European producer price index, is up 45% since the start of the war. This is tremendous. This is unseen before. The third point is that China is also, having an incredible strength vis-a-vis the BRICS. It is the most important player in the BRICS. BRICS is an acronym that was created by the economists to represent Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But really, BRICS is posing as an alternative platform to G7. There is a different bloc, different ideas, okay? And there is an idea of bilateral trade. So China is making propositions to their partners that are actually very good. They're building infrastructure, they're trading in their currency, and all of this together is kind of creating a shift that we really haven't seen before. And this was all sparked by the Ukraine war.
This is extremely important that I mentioned because we know that China literally bought, quote unquote, Africa and Latin America. That was the smartest way to conquer the world. Instead of going to war, you buy it. Basically, typical Roman expansion without the legions. And now there is this conversation. They appointed some stupid former Brazilian president to BRICS. We have this complicated president who has no idea on foreign policy. Talking about Brazil. And there's this conversation that, okay, let's shift. We're going to start our trade in reais and let's do it the trade currency. Of course, between talking and trying, there's a long distance. It's not the first time that countries or people or even China try to get rid of the dollar. We had this conversation in the past, was the euro, was whatever. That's the difficulty in reality, but the conversations are there. And that gets us back to the first point, why Xi Jinping has never intervened. Because he doesn't want the war to finish.
Yeah, but China also doesn't want a war in general. Yeah, I think China is a very peaceful, from a military standpoint, I think China's policy is very peaceful. It doesn't need to get into war, because if the war starts and China is directly involved, all of this will shift immediately. And China has been preparing its defenses in expectation of a potential conflict, but I actually really don't believe that it will be a military confrontation.
They got rid of Mao, but that's Zhou Enlai.
Yeah.
That's if you read what they're doing, is back in before Cultural Revolution. Everything that Zhou Enlai said, that still doing it.
But what you're talking about Brazil is interesting, because I think Brazil is being very impulsive, to be honest. I think the policy of Brazil is being extremely impulsive, and I think in this day and age, the policy has to be strategic. You cannot say, okay, I'm going to now suddenly switch to this or that. A lot of things will stay the same, even after these tectonic shifts, and this will be the end. I will be going towards the conclusion. A lot of things will have to stay the same. simply because of the way that the world is built. Okay,
Yeah,
so Brazil has to play an intelligent game. Okay, this is.
Well, when you have a president who was a former captain that was ousted from the army, and then the next president didn't even go to school, what can you expect? They don't even know the meaning of strategy. You know, it's just.
So okay, final two, 3 slides really. The part 3 of the dimensions of the hybrid war. So these are two charts. The first one is showing how the percentage of global reserves, okay, denominated in euros and dollars, are diminishing. So the dollar is really decreasing in terms of percentage of global reserves. It's down to about 58% now, down from maybe about 70% just in the beginning of the 2000s. But actually, this is not that important. I do not agree with a lot of the narratives that are saying that we're seeing the end of the dollar. No, we're not. We truly are not. We are not going to be able to see the end of the dollar until some other market comes up with a securities market that is as profound as the one in the United States, which took a century to build. So I'm not sure that we're going to be able to see any challenge to the US dollar. And the euro definitely is not a threat, because until the European Union doesn't take the step of collecting its debt, making it sort of one single European Union debt market, we are not going to ever be a challenge to the US hegemony when it comes to the currency. So a lot of the detractors of the US dollars are pointing to the fact that global central banks are now buying gold in quantities that have never been seen before. True, that is very true. And that's what I would do as well if I was a central bank. But gold is a tactical asset. There's not enough gold in the world to go even near the size of the financial system. Okay, we're talking about a $13 trillion global asset base. But gold is like diamond, right? When you buy a diamond, you're never going to resell it. I mean, the diamond is forever, the best marketing campaign in the world, right? So if you buy a diamond, that's off the supply side. When you buy physical gold, you put a chain on, you're not going to sell it because gold went up 5% tomorrow, right? So the actual real trading of gold, we're talking about $100 billion a day. This is very, very, very little, okay? So there is no way that central banks will be able to diversify away from the dollar so much to actually make it meaningful. But there will be a rebalancing, but this rebalancing is not against another currency, it's against all currencies. Because there is a bilateral trade paradigm that is starting to happen. And this is the real shift that is going on right now. The world is becoming more multilateral. But in a multilateral world, the United States will maintain its position as the dominant player globally. This is my thesis for this presentation. So very quickly, let's look at a few sort of different scenarios and what they depend on. So the Ukraine counteroffensive, from a short-term sort of tactical standpoint, the Ukraine counteroffensive, that has been discussed for quite some time. Actually, this is an important point, because if they have a strong success in this counteroffensive, and we cannot know now, because again, there is an incredible amount of aspects to this. But if there is a strong success, NATO will probably gear up its support to levels that we haven't seen before. They will actually, all NATO countries will find it easier politically to justify to their populations a hard increase in the amount of weapons that are given to Ukraine. But even just the partial success could be interesting, because if it's a partial success, this may bring to some form of a stalemate, and some of the global players that have been trying to bring the two warring factions to a truce, or at least to a ceasefire. And here I can name China, of course, but China is not a real objective judge in this, right? So it's difficult to use China as a mediator. But let's talk about Vatican. Actually, Vatican has been extremely active. It's not talked a lot, but they've been really trying very, very hard to bring the parties to talk. So maybe a partial success or a success of the Ukrainian counteroffensive could bring to a potential stalemate that even in the short run could bring the parties to talk. This is more of a wish than a real theory, but this is something that I think. The US elections in 2024. So the consensus is that Trump would be a positive for Russia and a negative for China. We know that Trump's stance on China has been very hard, but we also have heard Trump talk about the fact that one tenet of his policy would be to try to bring the parties to talk in terms of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. The flip side is that if Biden wins, probably would be more positive for China, at least in the short to medium term, because his administration seems to be much more focused on winning the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. And the last point is a potential China-Taiwan confrontation. If this were to happen, and I really hope it won't, then this would certainly shift the attention to that side of the world, because that particular conflict would be a lot more engaging and a lot more difficult actually to deal with. It would be extremely hard for Europe to be as supportive, and probably Europe would be left with dealing with Ukraine if this were to happen. To conclude, last slide, and look ahead. So, you know, a fast resolution of this conflict, unfortunately, doesn't seem likely, because the majority of the players don't have an interest in making this war end soon. Because, one thing that I didn't say is that while China benefits from the fact that the war continues, to some extent the US does too. Because the US is now gaining foothold as the strongest energy partner for Europe, right? It is reindustrializing. A lot of European companies are moving to the US. So to come back to your point, actually, it is Europe, the sort of the victim to some extent from an economic standpoint, of course. Nobody's talking about, you know, Ukraine clearly is the victim. So Europe is definitely in a very difficult position, and we will see how it deals with. We're looking at a more multilateral order emerging. This is, you know, it's a factor of geopolitics, right? There's just global population growth. The global south is becoming ever more important. The amount, you know, the relative size of the US GDP vis-a-vis the rest of the world is shrinking. So, you know, this is important to understand. It is not that the US is becoming less powerful, it's that many other countries are becoming more powerful. And so my belief is that the US will retain the status as a global leader, but it will need to reshape the relationship it has with the European Union. And we can see AUKUS as kind of the initial signal of that, right? So the US is going to be focusing a lot with, you know, resource-rich Australia, you know, intelligence and technology-rich UK, very strong partnership across multiple sides. But with the European Union, my personal belief is that it is important for the US to help the European Union actually strengthen itself and unify itself, because in a multipolar world, you want the Europeans to be completely aligned with US interests. If this had been the case, the European Union had a united military policy, if the EU had a united political front, if the EU was a federation effectively, then I really believe we would have never seen this conflict happen. Because Europe would have had to deal with it way ahead, way before its time. Whereas for Europe, it has been extremely comfortable to never pay more than a little bit for its own defense. To let the United States take care of that. Yes, it's NATO, but we know that NATO is predominantly funded by the United States. So Europe was in a very easy position for a long time, cheap gas coming, you know, we don't take care of defense, very, very beautiful world. This world is over. And now there are two ways to go. Either a fragmentation of Europe from a political standpoint, where you'll have a northern Europe that will be ever closer to the United States, a central Europe that will be in conflict with each other, because Germany and France are not seeing eye to eye on a lot of things. And then we have the south of Europe, that again is driven by completely different dynamics as well. So to me, my personal idea is that it is in the US interest, it was in the US interest in the past to have Europe predominantly as a trade partner, as a commercial partner. But I think that going forward, it will be very strategic for the United States to foster an integration of the European Union. Done under the auspice, of course, that the European Union can then pick up the tab on its own defense, relieve the United States of that weight so that the US can continue its pivot to Asia, and in this way build a multipolar world where you're not US versus everyone else, but it's US and Europe that are counterbalancing, with Russia in the middle, hopefully a Russia with a different government, a different outlook, counterbalancing in a way that basically would bring a global stability. I don't see a conflict to get to that. We need a Yalta, we don't need a conflict. And the last point, but this is the most important point, the Ukraine will need all available support for reconstruction. By the end of this war, which unfortunately is not going to be tomorrow, if we see what has happened in Mariupol, we've seen what has happened in Bakhmut, Ukraine will be devastated. The Ukrainians will need help not only in reconstruction, but also in reconstructing their institutions. It will be extremely important to ensure that the Ukraine is fully integrated in the West. Probably it will make sense to split political integration from military integration if we want an everlasting peace. Thank you. Any questions?
Don't you think NATO will also be reassessed because and also the EU, you see there are some conflicts in the EU between the EU and Poland, between the EU and Hungary because of the reforms that Orban and those brothers did in Poland and Hungary, but they have completely opposite views on the Ukraine-Russian war. Why Orban and Hungary are totally openly pro-Russia, Poland is adamantly against Russia for all the historic reasons that we know. And then on the other side you have Turkey, that is a NATO member, is also pro-Russia, and now you have Erdogan that was re-elected for, who knows, another 50 years. Okay, and that will be another impact in the Syrian war. You see, Assad was always, a villain. And now Assad is slowly being reintroduced to the world, which is tragic in a sense, but there's a tragedy that happens in the Middle East, and if you can go on with Iran, the region, blah, blah, blah. But getting back to that, maybe within this new scenario, Turkey is not that important. Maybe Finland is much more important to NATO than Turkey, considering the historical posture, and maybe Hungary is not that important to the EU. I mean, that's what I'm telling the EU. I think, my own opinion, I'd like to hear from you.
Well, I think you're touching a very important point, and I think I will add a bit of meat to the fire. Okay, I think that one of the reasons why European integration has been so slow has been the strength of NATO, right? So you can see the European Union as sort of one single market for goods. You can see it as a one single currency market, even though even that is fragmented. And when you look at a map of the institutions of Europe, you have so many different acronyms. The EEU, the European Economic Area, and then some members of something, other members of others. But there would be a few things that could be done to make that integration more functional, right? And one would be a partial debt unification, basically. One would be a European common army. It doesn't need to be all of the armies of the European countries together, but even having just one little conflict-ready battalion. I don't want to say battalion, but let's say 30,000, 20,000 soldiers.
An army.
Yeah, like a European force, right?
Yeah.
Well, that would be a step towards that would weaken NATO in and of itself, right? So there is this competing aspect. So what I think will happen is that you will see NATO split. You will see the US being at the center of a number of military alliances that will be specific to geographies. So, for example, you're rightly pointing out Poland is extremely adamantly against Russia, and it's a NATO member. Turkey is basically the Russian enabler right now, right? It gets anything in and out of Russia. It looks like one of those guys that used to work in the Swiss-Italian border in the 50s. They were able to bring anything overnight, right? So this is kind of the role of Turkey today. And I think that will be the decisive moment. We will see what happens with Turkey. If Turkey maintains its role in NATO, and there are reasons for that to happen, it actually is the strongest army in Europe, by the way. Turkey has the most fighter jets than any other European country in Europe. Okay, Turkey is considered the strongest army in Europe. I know that Turkey is partial in Europe and partial in Asia, but let's think of it geopolitically as a part of Europe right now. So what I think would happen, and what I think makes sense, coming back to this idea of multipolarity, is that we should probably see NATO kind of step back. Okay, NATO was created as a counterbalance to the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact doesn't exist anymore. So North Atlantic Treaty Organization is actually excluding Australia. It is excluding Japan, even in its definition, right? So I think what we'll probably see is maybe different types of NATO. We'll see NATO 1, NATO 2, NATO 3, I don't know how they will call them, right? But the US will be in charge of the security of a particular area together with some partners, and then in another area together with other partners, etc. And this, by the way, I think, incidentally, will make it easier to maintain peace. Because right now, whatever happens risks to become a global war, right? And we don't want to see World War III, especially when there is, thousands and thousands of nuclear warheads in play, right? So if the US were to redesign kind of this global system, it will need to be more participative to countries such as Brazil, India, and China. And this also, by the way, should be reflected in the United Nations. So we are no longer in 1945, right? Everything is built around the Yalta Agreements, 1945, 5 nuclear powers, everyone else is going to just kind of follow suit. This is no longer going to be the case, okay? So yeah, I think there will definitely be a redesign of NATO, but I don't know when that will happen. Sometimes, things should happen very quickly, but take decades to happen. So I wouldn't be surprised if 20 years from today it needs to be there.
Samir, this has been fascinating. Thank you very much. I hope you can join us for lunch. I'm sure there's a lot of people that would like to speak with you, and we can be here all day. Unfortunately, we probably should have scheduled you for a much longer period of time, because there's a lot of questions and a lot of different views here, and sharing your opinions and sharing your thoughts, your thesis has been very educational. I thank you. It's valuable to hear from you, from your perspective as a European, and has lived and studied in the U.S., in the West, and in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Really an honor. Really. Thank you.